Protesters keep up the pressure in Chile a day after political parties agree to hold a referendum on a new constitution. Another huge demonstration against the coup in Bolivia as the self-proclaimed government fails to take control. And Kenya moves to strengthen relations with the Caribbean as Antigua and Barbados Prime Minister Gaston Brown visits. Hello and welcome to Telesur English. I am Estefania Bravo. This is from the South. Protesters in Chile have returned to the Plaza Italia in Santiago the day after political parties signed an agreement to draw up a new constitution. Early in the afternoon, the police occupied the iconic square, which has been the focal point for 4 weeks of demonstrations against the neoliberal system. They fired tear gas at small groups of protesters. But in the last hour or two, much larger groups of protesters managed to retake the square. During recent weeks, the central demand of the protesters became a constituent assembly to bring sweeping change to Chile's political and economic system. Most organizations welcomed the agreement reached on Thursday night as a step in that direction, but many have reservations about the details and intend to keep up their pressure in the streets. Late on Thursday night, the main parties on the left and right signed the agreement to hold a referendum as the first step towards changing the Chilean constitution. The plebiscite was approved for April 2020 and will ask citizens whether they want a new constitution and what level of involvement parliamentarians should have in the process.
The political sectors that are present here are in agreement that for the first time Chileans are going to have a democratic constitution. And that's not coincidence. It's not simple the fact that we are here. It's necessity stemming from our mobilized society. This is the result of a people that have protested and obliged politicians to reach an agreement because the political system that didn't listen to the people was unsustainable.
Our correspondent in Santiago, Leonel Retamal, has the details on the new constitutional referendum.
It seems this agreement satisfies both sides and is a direct response to the protests against the government. Protesters in Chile had demanded a plebiscite to begin drafting a new constitution and the creation of a constituent assembly with elected members. This is a historic process in Chile, and for the first time, the people will participate in drafting a new constitution. Still, there are some sectors of society who are not satisfied because they have reservations about the details of the process, their political participation, and the role of social movements. It also seems that the protests won't end here. Social movements and protesters on the streets have become a political actor, and they are not likely to abandon their presence on the streets, where they have been for the last 4 weeks. Other questions remain, such as the accusations of human rights abuses, including rape and sexual abuse against women, and hundreds of people who lost their sight, with thousands more injured. The constituent process is expected to begin in the next 5 months, starting in April 2020, when Chileans will vote on whether they want a new constitution. In October, they will choose members of that constituent assembly to carry through the process, which could be ending in June or July 2021. Then a second plebiscite will take place to approve the text of the constitution drawn up.
We thank Leonel for that report. For the 4th day running, a huge demonstration has taken over the center of La Paz to protest against the coup and demand the restoration of democracy.
We are going to resist to the last, because we have overthrown a right-winger coup-monger and dictator before, Gonzalo Sanchez Lozada, who is now there in the U.S. empire as a lapdog. Now they have brought his student, Janine Áñez, but she, like the killer Luis Camacho and all the others, will have to pay. The people may be quiet sometimes, but we have memory, and we will not surrender. We will struggle to the death if we have to.
Most of the marchers set out from El Alto in the morning. Our correspondent Freddy Morales was there.
Hay gente que está viniendo de los 18 distritos.
We're in Alto, and from here a march is heading down to the center of La Paz. There are really a lot of people marching. Apart from this column that you can see, which itself is quite big, there are several other columns further ahead, closer to the city of La Paz. We're told that there are 2 other columns on their way, one from the Public University of El Alto and another from Desancata, which is where the state oil company has a plant. All the streets around that plant are blocked, which is why for the last 24 hours there has been no gasoline or diesel available in La Paz or El Alto. One of the new features of today's march into La Paz is the participation of a big contingent of miners who have arrived from the state mine at Corocoro. This is the first time in the last 4 days of protest against the coup that a group of miners from the interior of the Department of La Paz has taken part. As you know, the miners are a powerful force in Bolivia, and they sometimes carry dynamite on their protests. You can see also the red ponchos, who we've seen before during these protests. These are Aymara campesinos and women from the 20 provinces of the La Paz department. And of course, there are protesters here from the 18 districts in the city of El Alto, the most populated urban area in Bolivia, with more than 1 million inhabitants. They are all expressing their opposition to the political events of the last few days, which they say violate the constitution. They say they want to protect democracy in Bolivia, and that's why this is the 4th day of such protests.
As on previous days, some of Friday's protests ended with repression by the police. This was the scene in Sacaba in the department of Cochabamba when the security forces fired tear gas to disperse a peaceful protest against the coup. There was panic among the demonstrators as they tried to protect themselves from the police attack. The Cuban government has condemned the persecution of Cuban doctors and other personnel in Bolivia. It says the police raided the offices of the Cuban medical mission in La Paz. Cuba's embassy said the raid was carried out without any notification and without any warrant from the courts. Earlier, Cuba's foreign minister demanded the immediate release of 4 Cuban health workers. In a tweet, Bruno Rodriguez condemned a campaign instigating violence and hatred against Cuban personnel. He demanded guarantees that they could return home safely. Antigua and Barbuda's ambassador to the OAS, Sir Ronald Sanders, says the coup d'etat that took place in Bolivia was an atrocity and a clear violation of the rule of law. In a published opinion piece, Sanders contends that Janine Áñez was illegally installed as Bolivia's provisional president following a sham session of parliament. The ambassador says he fears transparent elections will not happen under Áñez in light of her racist statements about indigenous Bolivians. Sanders urges external forces to turn to constructive engagement instead of meddling in Bolivia's affairs. And while the self-proclaimed government in Bolivia has still not been able to consolidate its control, social movements are gathering strength to reverse the coup. Alejandro Kirk reports.
Images like this are burnt into the retinas of the Bolivian people. Beltran Mamami was one of the thousands of workers on the protests. In police stations like this, prisoners are mistreated, as the ombudswoman saw for herself.
This morning, we have been investigating the situation of the large number of people arrested yesterday, 79 in all. They have been beaten, denied food. When we arrived, some relatives were going in. They are badly overcrowded. There is no room to breathe.
The reports of brutality are backed up by videos, but the police deny any such thing.
We are really dismayed, and we really hope the demonstrators reflect on this. We always adhere to the principle of using force in gradual steps.
They come from all sides and take over the center of La Paz. They are amazingly peaceful, but they are clear on what they want.
Bolivia is under a dictatorship right now. We want Áñez to resign. She has dealt the country a terrible blow.
This is the People's Assembly in San Francisco Square near the government palace. The day before, they were attacked with tear gas here. Nearby, the police and soldiers are standing by again.
Their democracy doesn't reach El Alto, but our democracy is here, where the people are. Camacho, Áñez, and Albarracín have ridden roughshod over a peaceful people.
Acá presidente Evo Morales hupagnana karo churawa phetopia uno viviendas educación taquicuna wali askinaka discapacidad oxaros churtawa pheto.
The issue of the mainstream media is ever present.
We can only watch the international media as far as coverage of the protest is concerned. We have no domestic media at all. That is what we are complaining about.
The assembly ends and the conclusions are announced.
We propose to continue the resistance against the oligarchy. Approved, comrades. Approved.
The struggle continues, they decide. If they're successful, maybe this square full of soldiers and pigeons will again be full of people.
Coming up after the break, Barbados Prime Minister Mottley addresses Ghana's parliament. Stay with us. Welcome back to South. In Ecuador, 27 indigenous youth are currently before the court accused of terrorism. According to the prosecutor's office, the accused allegedly set fire to the Comptroller General's office during last month's national strike against economic measures announced by President Lenin Moreno. Meanwhile, members of several indigenous communities have gathered outside the court in support of the 27 who await their fate in the private hearing.
There is no real independency in the branches of government. We hope that today we have a favorable outcome in this hearing. I don't know what will take place today, but they don't have any evidence against them.
We feel humiliated, depressed, mistreated. We have seen how they killed us, how they injured us. All that the government has done. When they ask for votes, they come with a different face, with their lies. And now today we have seen how they treat women, kids, students.
Meanwhile, the Interior Minister admitted the police used expired tear gas to disperse anti-austerity protesters in October. This sparked outrage during the weeks of demonstrations. Maria Paula Romo said they were in the midst of an emergency and, quote, had to use what they had at hand, and that they weren't as harmful as protesters suggested. Moving on, it was an auspicious occasion when the University of the West Indies Open Campus in St. Lucia officially inked a Memorandum of Understanding with Venezuela's School of Planning. Telesur's correspondent Winston Springer brings us the details from Castries.
The die is cast following the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding between the University of the West Indies, represented by the Open Campus, and the Venezuelan School of Planning. This is in keeping with a bid to further capacity building and offer greater access to human resource training through public education. Officials from the two institutions of higher learning formally affixed their signatures to the MOU on Monday, November 11, 2019, at the UWI Open Campus on Mont Fortune in Castries, St. Lucia. Acting head of the St. Lucia campus, Leslie Crane Michelle, says the agreement has been long in the making.
It is, of course, a general MOU that has been signed, essentially saying that we agree to collaborate on the offering of programs to the people of St. Lucia. As it stands at this stage, the programs would be the programs that belong to, or emanate from, the Venezuela School of Planning, but of course we will provide the technical part of it. They will be offered through the University of the West Indies Open Campus St. Lucia.
The first course of study will cover a problematic area for St. Lucia. The Open Campus, through its Venezuelan partners, will offer a diploma in building planning.
As you know, we have been having many problems in St. Lucia with just that. Okay, a lot of our buildings not being maintained properly and causing all sorts of problems. So we thought that would be a very, very good place to start. So we are hoping that if everything goes according to plan, and of course we get the response that we expect to get once we begin advertising, that we should be able to get this off the ground by the middle of February.
Representatives from the Venezuelan School of Planning are buoyed by the agreement and eager to lend their expertise to further advance opportunities for higher education in the region.
We have the best professionals to participate as a docent.
Con amplia experiencia en el área de la construcción.
With a huge experience regarding to the experience of the maintaining of buildings.
The courses will be conducted via online learning platforms by professors from Venezuela who are proficient in the English language. Officials hope that this signing of the Memorandum of Understanding will redound to the benefit of both learning institutions. Winston Springer Jr., Telesaur, Castries, St. Lucia.
Barbados Prime Minister Mottley has addressed Ghana's parliament as she continues her official 3-day visit to the African country. Mottley also participated in a symbolic burial ceremony. The Caribbean leader brought with her the remains of an unknown enslaved African from Barbados to be buried at the Asin Manso ancestral river site. Mottley visited slave dungeons, cells, and the door of no return, and she's set to take part in the Damba festival in Yendi over the weekend. The Prime Minister has described the experience as both emotional and sobering. It is said that most Barbadians descended from Ghana.
Proud as a Caribbean leader, committed to claiming our Atlantic destiny, this time for the upliftment and prosperity of the individual citizens and not for their exploitation, enslavement, or decimation. Our connection is anchored in history and forged in blood. The initial interaction between Barbados and Ghana in the mid-17th century was as cogs in a transatlantic slave trade. We were, regrettably, two sides of an infamous triangular trade of commercial and human exploitation by colonial Europe.
And Kenya is rejuvenating bilateral ties with countries of the Caribbean region. President Uhuru Kenyatta has held separate talks in Nairobi with Antigua's Prime Minister Gaston Brown and Costa Rican Vice President Epsi Campbell-Barr. Kenyatta and Brown discussed establishing an embassy in Antigua that will serve Eastern Caribbean states. Kenya also got a boost in its bid for a non-permanent seat in the UN Security Council, with the Antiguan leader promising support. Meanwhile, Costa Rica's Vice President Campbell-Barr identified trade as one of several areas of future cooperation with Kenya. Moving on, a strike by more than 3,000 workers has brought South African Airways to its knees, with more than 200 flights grounded across the world. Workers downed tools on Friday morning after the airline refused to accept their demands for an 8% pay rise and a halt to the planned retrenchment of almost 1,000 workers. Management claims those are necessary to save the financially crippled airline. However, workers insist that they will not accept to carry the burden of a crisis that has been caused by, according to them, management's incompetence and corruption.
Where we find ourselves is not the workers' problem. It's management and the board's problem. So why must we pay the brunt? And to say you have no money, you put us in that position.
Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta has held bilateral talks with his Somalian counterpart Mohamed Farmajo as part of efforts by the two neighbors to mend their strained relations. During a meeting held in the Kenyan capital Nairobi, the two leaders agreed to restore bilateral ties between their countries. Speaking to journalists after the meeting, Kenyatta said flights between Nairobi and the Somalian capital Mogadishu will resume immediately. Coming up, Hong Kong police warn protesters they are moving one step closer to terrorism. Stay with us. Welcome back to From the South. As relative calm returns to Gaza, Israel's Foreign Minister Israel Katz is warning that his country will continue with targeted assassinations of Palestinians. According to local media reports, Katz told Israel Army Radio that Tel Aviv has no intention of changing its military policy despite signing an Egyptian brokered truce with Gaza-based Islamic struggle movement. The assassination of a senior Islamic struggle movement figure on Tuesday caused the recent wave of violence that resulted in 34 Palestinians dying in Israeli raids on the occupied Gaza Strip. Hong Kong police have warned protesters that they are moving one step closer to terrorism by sinking the city into chaos. On Thursday night, protesters set a toll booth on fire at a cross-harbor tunnel, paralyzing parts of the city for a fourth consecutive day. Over the past days, protesters have torched vehicles and buildings, hurled patrol bombs at police stations and trains, and vandalized a number of shopping malls and university campuses. China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs has accused the British government of covertly fueling the opposition protests in Hong Kong.
If the British side does not change its wrong practices and continues to add fuel to the fire, sow discord, and instigate others, then it will bring countercharges and calamity on itself. At the same time, we urge the British side to speak and act cautiously on Hong Kong issues and not send out false signals, sow discord and instigate others, intervene in Hong Kong affairs or interfere in China's internal affairs anymore.
And police in Hong Kong have opened a murder investigation after a man was killed during the increasingly violent opposition protest. The 70-year-old man died after being hit by a brick hurled by a protester when he attempted to clear a barricade set up by the protesters. City authorities have sent condolences to the man's family and vowed to bring the perpetrators to justice. On Monday, opposition supporters set a 57-year-old man on fire after dousing him with a flammable liquid.
During his lunch break, he was shooting video of his surroundings with his phone. However, someone hit his forehead with a brick. Unfortunately, the cleaner passed away last night.
We express condolence to the family of the deceased and will investigate into the case in depth. It's now classified as murder and under investigation by the New Territories North Regional Unit.
Cuba has unveiled a memorial for late South African President Nelson Mandela to mark the historic ties between the two countries. Mandela famously praised the Cuban Revolution as an inspiration to all freedom-loving people and was a strong supporter of the late leader Fidel Castro. As president of Cuba, Castro gave the African National Congress military support in the 1960s. In the 1970s and the 1980s, Cuba sent soldiers to fight in Angola, which weakened the government of South Africa and helped Mandela's anti-apartheid fight. After his release from prison, Mandela traveled to Cuba in 1991, saying the writings of revolutionary leader Ernesto Che Guevara served as an inspiration to him throughout his 27-year imprisonment.
Always, the South African people are very grateful to Cuba for all that Cuba does for us. And what's important to us is that at this park, which is the park of the founding fathers of the Organization of African Unity, South Africa has got two leaders. It's the leader Nelson Mandela that we unveiled his bust today, but we also have the bust of Oliver Tambo, the president of the ANC throughout the time when Nelson Mandela was in prison. So we are very grateful to the Cuban people for opening this park for us and asking again to unveil the bust of Nelson Mandela today. So thank you very much.
And finally, Italy has declared a state of emergency in Venice after the city was inundated by high floodwater levels. Heavy rainfall brought severe floods, which turned the city streets into virtual waterways. The historic basilica was also under several feet of water, while the electricity supply has been cut to several homes. Relief efforts are being coordinated. It's the fourth consecutive day of flooding in Venice. And with that, we've come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at telesurenglish.net. And also join us on social media. We are on Facebook, on Twitter, and on Instagram. For Telesur English, I am Stefania Bravo. Thank you for watching.
Follow the most important global events through a comprehensive perspective. with a team of journalists in 25 locations around the world to convey our people's reality. From the South,